In 1962, in the shallow waters of Roskilde Fjord in Denmark, a discovery was made. For years, fishermen knew of an underwater obstruction, a place where their nets would snag, and they called it the Skuldelev blockage. And people thought it might be an old ship deliberately sunk to block the channel from sea raiders. Divers went down to investigate. They found not one, but 5 Viking ships. One of them was different. It wasn't the sleek, fearsome longship built for war. This one was wide. It was deep. It was built from Norwegian pine and Danish oak around 1030 AD. This was a cargo ship. It was a Knarr. Archaeologists carefully recovered the timbers. They pieced the vessel back together. What emerged was a workhorse of the sea. The Skuldelev one, as it became known, was about 16 meters long and nearly 5 meters wide. It had a deep rounded hull designed for one thing capacity. Calculations showed it could carry a cargo of up to 24 tons. This single ship could transport 60 cows, or it could carry the timber to build several houses, or it could move dozens of people, their tools, their seeds, and their livestock across hundreds of miles of open, violent ocean. This was the ship that did the hard work. It was the ship that carried the people and the animals that settled Iceland in the 9th century. It was the ship that carried Eric the Red and his followers to Greenland in the 980s. The longship raided the coasts. But the Knarr built the Viking world. It was a slow, sturdy, unassuming vessel, and it changed everything. Number 20, a ship stitched the modern gene pool together. In the year 874, a man named Hrafna Floki Vilgerdarson sailed from western Norway. He was not looking for a quick raid. He was looking for a new home. He loaded his Knarr with his family, his followers, and his livestock. The ship was not fast. It was a tub built for stability, not speed, but it could carry the beginnings of a new life. Floki's journey was part of a great migration. Thousands of Norse people were leaving Norway. They were seeking land and freedom from the growing power of King Harald Fairhair. Their destination was a large, empty island they had heard about in the west, Iceland. The people on these ships were mostly from western and northern Norway. Their Y chromosomes, passed from father to son, show this clearly. Modern genetic studies of the Icelandic population trace a direct, strong line back to these regions of Norway. But the story the DNA tells is more complicated than that. The mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down from mother to child, tells a different story. A large percentage of the founding female population of Iceland was not Norse. It was Gaelic from Ireland and Scotland. How did this happen? The Knarr provides the answer. Before sailing for Iceland, many Viking voyages involved raiding or trading in the British Isles. They came for silver and goods, but they also took people. Women were captured in raids on Irish and Scottish coastal communities. They were taken as slaves or thralls. Some were later married to their captors. When a Norseman like Floki decided to leave for Iceland, he did not always travel with a Norse wife. He might bring a Gaelic woman, a thrall who was now part of his household, perhaps the mother of his children. A single Knarr, loaded with maybe 30 or 40 people, was a microcosm of this genetic mixing. On board would be a Norse chieftain, his family, and his free retainers. Their DNA was mostly Scandinavian, but also on board would be the thralls, the men and women who did the hard labor. Many of these women were from the Celtic world. The ship, slow and steady, carried these 2 distinct gene pools across the North Atlantic. For weeks, they lived together in the cramped open hull. They shared food. They endured storms. They cared for the seasick animals. When they landed in Iceland, they founded a new society on an empty island. The DNA they brought with them became the foundation of the Icelandic people. This pattern repeated itself ship after ship, year after year, for about 60 years during the Age of Settlement. The Knarr was the physical vehicle of this genetic merger. It wasn't a warship carrying warriors, it was a cargo ship carrying families, and the genetic makeup of those families was already a hybrid. It carried the Norsemen who sought new land, and the Gaelic women they brought with them. The result is the unique genetic profile of Icelanders today. It's a mix of Scandinavia and the British Isles, a blend created in the decades of raiding and migration and delivered to its final destination in the deep, wide belly of a Knarr. Number 19, the ship that birthed an industry. In the late 10th century, a farmer named Ulf in the East Riding of what is now Yorkshire looked at his flock of sheep. These were not remarkable animals. They were hardy, their wool was thick and greasy with lanolin. It kept them alive during the cold, damp winters. For Ulf and his family, the sheep provided milk, meat, and wool for their own clothes. It was a local subsistence economy. But something was changing. Merchants were arriving in the port of York. They were Norsemen or men of Norse descent. The city was a Viking hub, the capital of a northern kingdom. These merchants came on ships that were not long and slender, but short and fat. They came on Knarrs. They weren't interested in silver or slaves. They were interested in wool, huge, unwashed, greasy bales of it. Across the North Sea, in a region called Flanders, the towns of Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres were growing. The weavers there were developing new techniques. They had large, sophisticated looms. They knew how to produce fine dyed cloth that was in demand all over Europe. But they had a problem. They didn't have enough wool. The local sheep couldn't meet the demand. They needed a massive, steady supply of raw material. The Knarr was the bridge that connected Ulf's sheep to the weavers of Flanders. A merchant in York could buy hundreds of bales of wool from farmers like Ulf. A single Knarr, with its 20-ton capacity, could carry an immense amount of this raw wool. It was a bulky, low-value cargo not worth transporting on a fast, smaller ship. But for the slow, high-volume Knarr, it was perfect. The ship would be loaded to the gunwales with rough, smelly fleece. It would then make the relatively short, safe journey across the North Sea to the mouth of the Zwin estuary, the gateway to Bruges. This trade route, established and dominated by the Knarr, had enormous consequences. For England, it was the beginning of its transformation into a major European economic power. The wool trade became the bedrock of the English economy for centuries. It generated immense wealth. It led to the clearing of forests to create more pasture for sheep. It changed the entire landscape. For Flanders, it fueled the growth of its powerful cloth-making cities. These cities became centers of wealth, art, and political power. The Knarr was the secret engine of this revolution. It was the right technology at the right time. Its large hold made the bulk transport of wool profitable. Its sturdy design could handle the rough North Sea. It didn't get the attention of the warships, but it was doing something far more important. It was creating an integrated Northern European economy. It connected the rural sheep farmer in Viking-controlled England with the urban artisan in Flanders. It turned a simple agricultural product into an international commodity, and it did this load by load, a slow and steady stream of floating wool sheds crossing the sea, laying the foundation for the medieval economic world. Number 18, a ship made self-government possible. The year is 930. In Iceland, a group of chieftains and farmers gather at a place called Thingvellir, or Assembly Plains. They are there to establish a common law for the entire island. They create the Althing, one of the world's first parliaments, and it was a remarkable achievement. A scattered population of immigrants living on a remote volcanic island created a sophisticated system of self-government without a king. But this entire political experiment depended on a boat. The men who gathered at Thingvellir were practical people. They were farmers, herders, and traders. Their lives were governed by the harsh realities of their new home. Iceland had very few trees. The native birch was small and twisted, not suitable for building large structures or ships. The island had no grain to speak of. It lacked iron ore. To survive, let alone build a society, the Icelanders needed to import nearly everything. They needed timber for their houses and churches. They needed iron for their tools and weapons. They needed grain for bread and ale. All of these essential goods arrived in the belly of a Knarr. The connection to Norway was a lifeline. Each summer, a fleet of Knarrs would make the perilous journey from Bergen in Norway to the trading posts on the Icelandic coast. The journey took a week or more, depending on the wind. The ships were loaded with timber, iron bars, flour, and malt. The Icelandic chieftains, the very men who founded the Elthing, were often the owners or financiers of these ships. Their wealth and their power came from this trade. A chieftain's authority was not just based on his land or his followers. It was based on his ability to provide the goods his community needed. The chieftain who could bring a Knarr load of Norwegian pine to his district was a powerful man. He could build a large longhouse. He could provide his farmers with the iron they needed for their plows. He could offer grain for feasts. This economic power translated directly into political power at the Althing. The Althing itself was a physical expression of this trade. The booths where the chieftains and their followers lived for the 2 weeks of the assembly were built with imported timber. The laws they debated often concerned trade. There were laws about the price of goods, the rights of foreign merchants, and the standards for Icelandic exports, mainly wool and falcons. The entire legal and political structure was built on the assumption of regular, reliable contact with the outside world. Without the Knarr, this would have been impossible. A longship could not carry enough timber to matter. It was built for speed and men, not bulk cargo. The Knarr was the only vessel that could carry the raw materials of civilization across the North Atlantic. It allowed the Icelandic settlement to be more than just a subsistence-level outpost. It enabled the creation of a complex society with a shared legal code and a national assembly. The ship didn't just carry wood and iron, it carried the very possibility of law and order. The debates at Thingvellir were made possible by the slow, steady arrival of the cargo ships, season after season. Number 17, the ghost herds of Greenland. Around the year 1000, a farmer named Thorkel lived in the eastern settlement of Greenland. He was the son of one of the original settlers who had come over with Eric the Red in 985. His life was a constant struggle against the cold. His family survived on milk and cheese from their small herd of cows and meat from sheep and goats. They supplemented this with seal and caribou hunted from the fjord, but Thorkel, like his neighbors, dreamed of something more. The Greenlanders were trying to recreate the Norwegian farming life they had left behind. The Knarr had brought them to this new land. It had carried their precious livestock across the ocean. Cows, sheep, goats, pigs, and horses all made the journey in the open holds of these cargo ships. It was an incredible feat of animal husbandry and seamanship. Imagine dozens of seasick animals crammed together for weeks on a rolling deck. Many would have died, but enough survived to establish herds in Greenland. The cows were the most prized. They were a status symbol, a connection to their European identity, but Greenland was not Norway. The summers were short. The growing season for fodder was dangerously brief. In a good year, farmers like Thorkel could just barely harvest enough grass to keep their animals alive through the long, dark winter. In a bad year, they faced a devastating choice: slaughter the animals they couldn't feed or watch them starve. The Greenland Norse were stubborn. They clung to their farming way of life, but they also tried to adapt. The archaeological record shows they experimented. The sagas tell stories of attempts to introduce new animals. At one point, Leif Eriksson's brother Thorstein attempted a voyage to Vinland. His goal may not have been just exploration. It might have been a search for resources, perhaps even new animals, better suited to their environment. More concretely, some evidence suggests the Greenlanders may have tried to domesticate the native caribou. They were expert hunters of the animal, but could they turn it into a herd animal like the reindeer of the Sami people in northern Scandinavia? It would have made sense. The caribou were perfectly adapted to the Greenlandic environment. They could survive the harsh winters on their own. If such an experiment was attempted, it would have required knowledge. Perhaps a Greenlander on a trading voyage back to Norway traveled north and learned from the Sami. The Knarr was the only link. It was the vessel that brought news, ideas, and people back and forth. Any new idea about animal husbandry, any attempt to bring in a new breed of sheep or even a captured caribou calf for an experiment would have traveled on a Knarr. Ultimately, these experiments failed. The Greenlanders never managed to create a sustainable livestock economy, and they remained dependent on their European animals which became smaller and less productive over the generations. When the climate began to cool in the 14th century during the Little Ice Age, their fragile farming system collapsed. The pastures shrank, the winters grew longer, the sea ice choked the fjords, making sealing difficult and cutting them off from the vital trade with Norway. The Knarrs stopped coming. The ghost herds, the animals that never were, represent the Greenlanders' struggle to adapt. The Knarr brought them the animals that allowed them to settle the land, but it could not bring them the animals that would allow them to survive there forever. Number 16, the ship that built in stone. In the 12th century on the island of Orkney, north of Scotland, a great cathedral began to rise. St. Magnus Cathedral in Kirkwall was a massive undertaking. It was a statement of power and faith by the Norse earls who ruled the islands. It was built of local red and yellow sandstone. But for the finer decorative work, the sculptors needed a different kind of stone. They needed something soft enough to carve into intricate patterns, yet durable. They needed soapstone. There was no good source of soapstone on Orkney. The nearest high-quality deposits were in Norway and, more importantly, on the Shetland Islands, another part of the Norse earldom. The challenge was how to transport tons of this heavy, bulky material across the water to the construction site in Kirkwall. The answer was the Knarr. A man named Sigurd, a shipmaster from Shetland, might have been one of the men who did this work. His life was not one of adventure and raiding. It was a life of hard, repetitive labor guided by the seasons and the needs of trade. In the spring, he would sail his Knarr to the soapstone quarries. Men would cut large blocks of the soft grayish stone from the hillside. Using wooden levers and rollers, they would haul the heavy blocks down to the shore and load them into the ship's hold. A Knarr could carry 20 tons or more. That's a huge amount of stone. Sigurd would have to carefully balance the load to ensure the ship was stable. The journey from Shetland to Orkney was short, but the waters of the North Sea could be treacherous. A poorly loaded ship could easily capsize in a sudden squall. He would navigate by sight, following the coastline, a skill passed down through generations. When he arrived in Kirkwall, his cargo of stone would be unloaded and taken to the masons working on the new cathedral. They would carve it into beautiful doorways, window frames, and pillars. The soapstone was essential. Without it, the cathedral would have been a plainer, less impressive building. This was not a one-time journey. The construction of St. Magnus Cathedral took decades. For years, a steady stream of Knarrs like Sigurd's would have arrived, carrying the raw materials of its creation. This was happening all over the Viking world. Churches, monasteries, and high-status buildings required materials that were not always available locally. Fine stone for carving, slate for roofing, even lime for mortar often had to be imported. The Knarr was the heavy-duty truck of its day. It moved the building blocks of medieval society. We often think of Viking age buildings as being, made of wood and turf, and many were, but for their most important structures they used stone. And the Knarr was the tool that made monumental stone architecture possible in the scattered island communities of the North Atlantic. It allowed them to concentrate resources from a wide area onto a single project. The stones of St. Magnus Cathedral are not just a testament to the faith of the Norse earls. They are also a testament to the cargo capacity of their unassuming ships. Number 15, the white gold that financed a colony. In the year 1245, a Knarr named the Greenland Rover sailed from the eastern settlement in Greenland. Its captain was a man named Bjarni Grimson. The ship's hold was not filled with wool or timber. It was filled with some of the most valuable luxury goods in Europe. There were bundles of pure white jerfalkins prized by kings and princes for hunting. There were thick waterproof sealskins. And there were ropes, incredibly strong ropes, made not from hemp, but from walrus hide. But the most precious cargo was the walrus tusks. This was the ivory of the North. For a time, it was more valuable than gold. The walrus lived in the northern waters, in the hunting grounds of the Greenland Norse, far to the north of their farms. Each year, hunting parties would sail to these grounds, a dangerous journey. They would hunt the massive animals on the ice floes. It was risky work. A flick of a walrus's head could smash a boat to pieces, but the reward was immense. The tusks were brought back to the settlements. There, they were cleaned and packed for the long journey to Europe. And Bjarni's Knarr was the only way to get them there. The voyage to Bergen in Norway was the longest and most dangerous trade route in the Viking world. It was a journey of over 1,500 miles across the stormiest part of the North Atlantic. It could take weeks, even months. Ships were frequently lost, but the profits were so high that the risk was worth it. When Bjarni's ship finally arrived in Bergen, merchants would be waiting. The tusks would be sold and then transported south to the workshops of Paris, Cologne, and London. There, master craftsmen would carve the ivory into exquisite objects. There they made crucifixes, chess pieces, and luxury items for the wealthy. The famous Lewis chessmen found on a Scottish island were carved from Greenlandic walrus ivory. This trade was the sole reason the Greenland colony was economically viable. The small, struggling farms could not produce enough surplus to support the community. They couldn't export wool or grain. Their only export of value was the products of the hunt, and the walrus was king. The entire colony was financed by the ivory trade. The tithes they paid to the church in Rome were often paid in walrus tusks. A tusk was sent to the Vatican in 1327 to help finance a crusade. The Knarr was the linchpin of this entire system. It was the only ship that could carry the bulky, heavy tusks in sufficient quantity to make the journey profitable. And it was the only ship that could bring back the goods the Greenlanders needed to survive iron, grain, and timber. For nearly 400 years, the Greenland colony survived, a tiny European outpost on the edge of the Arctic. It existed because the Knarr could bridge the vast ocean. It carried the white gold of the north to the markets of Europe, and in return, it brought back the essentials of life. When the Knarrs stopped coming, the colony died. Number 14, the ship that ate a forest. When Ingolfur Arnarsson, the first permanent Norse settler of Iceland, arrived around 874, the landscape he found was very different from the Iceland of today. The sagas describe a land forested from mountain to seashore. Archaeological and pollen analysis confirms this. About 25% of the island was covered in woodland, mostly downy birch. It wasn't a dense forest like those in Norway, but it was a vital resource. Ingolfur arrived on a Knarr. His ship and the hundreds that followed it were packed with people and livestock. A single ship might carry 20 to 30 people, along with a few cows, a flock of sheep, pigs, and a horse. When these settlers landed, their first priority was to build a shelter and clear land for pasture. They needed wood. They cut down the birch trees to build their longhouses. They used the wood for fuel to cook their food and smelt the local bog iron. They built fences to contain their animals. The Knarrs that brought them there had used up Norwegian timber for their own construction. Now the settlers consumed the local forests, but the biggest impact came from the animals that the Knarrs had transported. The sheep, in particular, were devastating to the fragile Icelandic ecosystem. They were set loose to graze in the woodlands. They ate the young saplings, preventing the forest from regenerating. The pigs rooted up the forest floor. Over the decades, as more and more settlers arrived on more and more Knarrs, the pressure on the forests grew. Each Knarr represented a new wave of deforestation. It was a floating package of axes, people, and grazing animals. The process was relentless. Within a few generations, the landscape was transformed, the woodlands shrank dramatically. The thin volcanic soil, no longer held in place by tree roots, began to erode. The wind and rain stripped it away, leaving behind barren gravel plains. By the time the age of settlement was over, around 930, most of Iceland's original forest was gone. This had a profound effect on the society that developed there. The wood became a scarce and precious commodity. Icelanders had to become experts in conservation. They built their houses out of turf and stone, using wood only for the internal frame. But for anything that required large, strong timbers, like building a new sea-going ship, they had a problem. The irony was that the very ship that had enabled the settlement of Iceland was now almost impossible to build there. The Knarr had delivered a population that consumed the resources needed to reproduce it. To maintain contact with the outside world, to trade for the grain and iron they needed, the Icelanders became completely dependent on ships built in Norway from Norwegian timber. The Knarr became a symbol of their connection to the world, but also of their environmental predicament. It was the vessel that had brought the settlers to a new land, and in doing so, had set in motion the destruction of its most valuable resource. Number 13, the Sea Road's common language. In the year 950, a merchant ship, a Knarr, was tied up at a wharf in Dublin. The city was a bustling hub of the Viking world. On the dock, the ship's captain, a man named Ivar from Norway, was negotiating a price for his cargo of soapstone bowls and whetstones. The buyer was a local Hiberno-Norse lord named Sitrick. A few feet away, a trader from Iceland was trying to sell dried fish to a merchant from the Danelaw in England. An artisan from the Isle of Man was examining a shipment of Norwegian timber. All of these men from different lands and different backgrounds were able to communicate with each other. They spoke the same language, Old Norse. It was the lingua franca of the northern seas, and the Knarr was the vehicle that spread it. Unlike the Latin of the church or the formal languages of royal courts, Old Norse was the language of work. It was the language of sailors, traders, farmers, and craftsmen. It was a practical, direct language full of words for ships, weather, goods, and contracts. As the Knarrs pushed out from Scandinavia, they carried this language with them. When a Knarr from Bergen arrived in Iceland, the crew spoke the same tongue as the local farmers. When it sailed to the Orkneys, Shetland, the Hebrides, or the Isle of Man, the locals understood them. These islands were all part of a Norse-speaking cultural world. In the trading towns of Ireland like Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick, Old Norse was the language of commerce. In the Danelaw of England, it blended with Old English, leaving behind hundreds of words in the modern English language. Or words like ski, skin, leg, window, husband, law, axle, and plough festival that had been ploughed are all of an Old Norse origin. They are words of everyday life, brought by settlers and traders on their Knarrs. The Knarr created a vast, interconnected community. A sailor from Iceland could sign on to a ship in Dublin and feel at home. A merchant from Norway could set up shop in York and conduct his business without a translator. This shared language facilitated trade, of course. It made it easier to haggle prices, draw up contracts, and resolve disputes. But it did more than that. It created a shared identity. People across the North Atlantic and the Irish Sea listened to the same poems and sagas about heroes and gods. They shared a common mythology and a common way of looking at the world. The stories of Odin and Thor were told in the smoky longhouses of Iceland and in the trading booths of Dublin. This cultural unity was not imposed by a central government or an empire. It grew organically out of the countless everyday interactions made possible by the cargo ship. The Knarr was a slow ship. Voyages took a long time. The crews would spend weeks together sharing stories and news. When they arrived in a new port, they would bring not just their goods, but also the latest news from home, the newest poems, the most recent gossip. The ship was a vector for information and culture, as much as it was for timber and wool. It stitched together the scattered Norse world with the thread of a common language. Number 12, a city built on imports. In the 11th century, Dublin was one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the British Isles. It had been founded by Vikings over 200 years earlier, and it was the center of a powerful Norse kingdom. The archaeological excavations at sites like Woodquay and Fishamble Street have revealed a city of remarkable sophistication. The preservation was so good that entire houses, workshops, and pathways were found intact, buried in layers of mud. And this archaeological evidence tells one overwhelming story. Dublin was a city that lived on imports, and those imports came by Knarr. A craftsman named Thorstein lived and worked on Fishamble Street around the year 1020. He was a comb maker. He carved intricate combs from deer antler. His workshop and house were a typical Dublin design. The walls were post and wattle, a woven lattice of hazel rods covered in daub. The roof was likely thatched. But the main structural timbers, these strong oak posts that held the building up, were not local. Analysis of the wood grain shows that many of these timbers came from other parts of Ireland or even from England. Dublin was surrounded by good farmland, but not by the kind of mature oak forest needed for major construction. To build their city, the Vikings of Dublin needed to import vast quantities of timber. The Knarr was the perfect vessel for this. A ship could sail up the coast to the woods of Wicklow or across the Irish Sea to the forests of Cumbria. There, trees would be felled, roughly shaped into posts and planks, and loaded into the wide hold of the ship. This steady supply of timber allowed Dublin to grow and to be constantly rebuilt, but it wasn't just timber. Thorstein, the comb maker, needed tools. The iron for his knives and saws was likely imported, perhaps from England or the continent. The whetstones he used to sharpen them were a specific type of schist that came from quarries in Norway. Thousands of these Norwegian whetstones have been found in Dublin. They were a standard trade item, a vital piece of industrial equipment, and they came exclusively by Knarr. Even the pitch and tar needed to waterproof the ships in Dublin's harbor was an import. It was made from pine trees, which did not grow in Ireland. The best tar came from the vast pine forests of Scandinavia. It was a strategic commodity, essential for maintaining the fleet that was the source of Dublin's power and wealth. The Knarrs would arrive with barrels of this black, sticky substance, a crucial fuel for the city's maritime economy. The Knarr made the urban Viking experiment in Ireland possible. It was a floating pipeline connecting the city to the resources it needed to exist. It brought the timber for the houses, the iron for the tools, the stone for sharpening, and the tar for the ships. In return, the Knarrs left Dublin loaded with the products of its hinterland hides, wool, and, tragically, a large number of slaves captured in Irish wars. The city was a node in a vast trading network, a point where goods from all over the Viking world were gathered and redistributed. And every single piece of that network was connected by the slow, sturdy, indispensable cargo ship. Number 11, the ship that carried a new faith. Around the year 995, a ship sailed from England bound for Norway. It was a Knarr, but its owner and passenger was no ordinary merchant. He was Olaf Tryggvason, a claimant to the Norwegian throne. He had been a Viking raider, a mercenary in the service of Slavic princes and Byzantine emperors. But in England, he had converted to Christianity. Now he was returning to Norway not just to seize power, but to convert his homeland to his new faith. His Knarr was loaded with the tools of this mission. It carried priests and bishops he had recruited in England. In its hold were not bales of wool or barrels of fish, but chalices, vestments, and stone for building altars. The ship was a floating missionary expedition. When Olaf landed in Norway, he began a brutal and effective campaign to Christianize the country. He used a combination of persuasion, bribery, and force. Chieftains who refused to be baptized were often tortured or killed. The Knarr played a quiet but essential role in this religious transformation. The longship was the instrument of Olaf's military power, the tool he used to crush his pagan opponents. But the Knarr was the instrument of construction. Once a region was converted, churches had to be built. The first churches in Norway were stave churches, complex wooden structures that required huge amounts of high-quality pine timber. The Knarrs were used to transport these massive timbers from the forests of the interior down the fjords to the sites of the new churches. A few years later, in the year 1000, the Althing in Iceland was debating whether to adopt Christianity. The decision was a political one, made to avoid a civil war and an invasion from the newly Christian Norway. Once the law was passed, the process of conversion began. But Iceland had no priests, no churches, and no religious paraphernalia. All of it had to be imported. A chieftain named Geysir the White, one of the Christian leaders, would have sponsored a voyage. His Knarr would sail to Norway or England. It would return not with grain and iron, but with a priest, a set of sacred books, and the materials needed to build a small wooden church on his farm. The ship's hold, which once might have carried goods for trade with worshippers of Thor and Odin, now carried the infrastructure of a new religion. This happened all over the Norse world. As Christianity spread to Orkney, Shetland, the Faroe Islands, and even Greenland, the Knarr was the delivery vehicle. It brought the missionaries, it brought the timber and the stone to build the first chapels, it brought the bells that would ring out over the fjords, replacing the silence or the sounds of pagan rituals. The ship itself was neutral. It was a tool. But by carrying these new people, new ideas, and new materials, it became an agent of profound cultural change. It dismantled the old pagan world piece by piece and replaced it with the structures of medieval Christendom. The conversion of the Norse was a complex process of politics, faith, and violence, but at a purely practical level, it could not have happened without a ship capable of carrying the heavy, bulky apparatus of a new religion across the sea. Number 10, the settlement that needed a workhorse. In the year 1960, the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife, archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, discovered the remains of a Norse settlement at a place called Lanse Aas Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland in Canada. This was physical proof of the Viking sagas, which told of a land called Vinland, discovered by Leif Erikson around the year 1000. The discovery was electrifying. It was the first confirmed European settlement in the Americas, nearly 500 years before Columbus. The sagas, particularly the saga of the Greenlanders and Eric the Red saga, describe several voyages to Vinland. They talk about Leif Erikson's initial exploration. They talk about subsequent attempts to establish a permanent colony. These sagas are full of adventure, conflict with the native people, the Norse, called Skraelings, and drama. They often focus on the ships used for exploration, which were likely smaller, faster vessels, perhaps even longships. But the settlement at Lanse Meadows was not a temporary camp. The excavations revealed several buildings, including longhouses and workshops. There was a forge for smithing iron. This was an attempt to build a real functioning community. And to do that, you need more than a fast exploration ship. You need a Knarr. One of the Vinland voyages described in the sagas was led by a man named Thorfinn Karlsefni. He was a wealthy Icelandic merchant. The saga says he set out with 3 ships and 160 people. His expedition included women and livestock. This was not a raid. It was a full-blown colonization attempt. The only ship that could have carried women, children, and cattle across the Davis Strait from Greenland to North America was the Knarr. Imagine the scene at the Greenland settlement before they departed. The Knarrs would have been loaded with all the essentials for starting a new life. They would have brought iron bars to be worked in the new forge. They brought grain for planting, although the sagas say their attempts at farming were not successful. Most importantly, they brought livestock. A bull and several cows were loaded into the holds, noisy, smelly, and precious cargo. These animals were the key to establishing a European-style farm in the new land. The settlement at Lanse Aas Meadows was probably a base camp. From here, the Norse could explore further south, searching for the grapes that gave Vinland its name and the timber that was so scarce in Greenland. Any timber they cut, any resources they gathered, would have been loaded onto a Knarr for the return journey to Greenland. The ship's cargo capacity was essential to the entire economic purpose of the settlement. The Vinland colony did not last. The sagas blame conflict with the native population. The small group of Norse settlers was too far from home, too few in number to defend themselves. After only a few years, they abandoned Lanse Meadows and returned to Greenland. But the Knarr remains the unsung hero of the story. While Leif Erikson's discovery voyage gets the glory, it was the slow, sturdy Knarr that made a real settlement attempt possible. It was the ship that carried the families, the animals, and the tools. It represents the logistical reality behind the heroic myth of discovery. To found a new world, you need not just explorers, but also the cargo ship to carry the substance of the old one. Number 9, the lifeline of grain. The year is 1355. A ship, an old but sturdy Knarr, arrives at the eastern settlement in Greenland. It is the last official ship known to have made the journey from Norway. It was called the Greenland Knarr, a state-sponsored vessel meant to maintain contact with the distant colony. On board was a priest named Ivar Bardarsson. His report on the state of the colony is one of our last direct accounts of the Norse Greenlanders. For the people of the settlement, the arrival of this ship was a matter of life and death. They gathered at the docks, their faces thin from a long winter, or they were not looking for luxury goods. They were looking for basics. They needed iron to mend their tools. They needed timber to repair their boats and houses. Most of all, they needed grain. Greenland was a farming community, but it was farming on the absolute edge of possibility. The short, cool summers meant they could not grow their own grain. Wheat, barley, and rye, the staples of the European diet, would not ripen. This meant no bread, no porridge, and, perhaps most distressingly for a Norse community, no ale. All of it had to be imported. Every year, the Greenlanders would trade their valuable walrus, ivory, sealskins, and polar bear hides for a Knarr load of grain and other necessities from Norway. The Knarr was their lifeline. It was a slow, perilous journey. The ship had to navigate through the ice-choked waters of the Denmark Strait, but its deep hull could carry enough flour and malt to see the colony through another year. The entire social and religious life of the community depended on this shipment. To celebrate Mass, the church needed bread and wine. The wine was an expensive import. But the flour for the communion wafers came in the same sacks as the flour for their meager loaves of bread. The great feasts that marked the seasons and bound the community together required ale. The malt to brew that ale came on the Knarr. As the 14th century progressed, this lifeline began to fray. The climate was getting colder, the sea ice was becoming more extensive, making the voyage from Norway more dangerous and longer. The economy of Europe was changing. The Black Death devastated Norway, disrupting its ability to send ships, and the value of walrus ivory, Greenland's main export, was plummeting as cheaper elephant ivory from Africa began to reach European markets via new trade routes. The Knarrs came less and less frequently. The Greenlanders were left isolated. The archaeological evidence from the last years of the settlement is grim. The people were getting shorter, a sign of malnutrition. Their diet shifted almost entirely to seal meat. They were cut off. The last ship in 1355 was a flicker of a connection that was about to be extinguished. When the connection was finally broken, the colony starved, not just of food, but of the materials and culture that defined them as European. They clung on for a few more generations, but by the mid-15th century, the Norse settlement in Greenland was gone. The Knarr was the umbilical cord that had sustained them for 400 years. When it was cut, the colony withered and died. Number 8. A law carried on the waves. In the early 11th century, a man named Skapti Thorodsson held one of the most important positions in Iceland. He was the law speaker of the Althing. For 2 weeks every summer, he stood on the law rock at Thingvellir and recited 1/3 of the entire legal code of the Icelandic Commonwealth from memory. He also presided over the legal assembly, where new laws were made and disputes were settled. It was a position of immense prestige and responsibility. But the Icelandic law, known as the Gragas or Grey Goose Laws, was not a static document. It was a living tradition based on laws brought from Norway by the original settlers, and it needed to be kept up to date. The Icelanders recognized the authority of the Norwegian king, and changes in Norwegian law often needed to be incorporated into Icelandic law. This created a problem. How do you keep the legal codes of two countries, separated by 1,000 miles of rough ocean, in sync? The solution involved a man like Skapti and a ship, a Knarr. Every few years, the law speaker or a designated legal expert would undertake a journey to Norway. This was not a trip for a fast warship. It was a formal diplomatic mission. The lawyer would book passage on a merchant Knarr sailing from one of the Icelandic trading posts. Well, the journey would take a week or more. He would spend his time on the open deck, wrapped in woolen cloaks, perhaps reviewing legal texts, or simply enduring the misery of seasickness along with the other passengers and crew. When he arrived in Bergen, he would travel to the court of the Norwegian king. There, he would spend the winter. He would consult with the king's legal experts, learning about new laws concerning inheritance, trade, or church matters. He was a student, but also an ambassador representing the legal independence of the Icelandic Commonwealth. In the spring, he would board another Knarr for the return journey. In his mind, and perhaps in written notes on precious parchment, he carried the legal updates. When the Althing convened that summer, he would propose the new laws to the assembled chieftains. They would debate them, and if they agreed, the laws would be incorporated into the Gragas. This slow, deliberate process, entirely dependent on the seasonal sailings of the Knarr, was the legislative backbone of the Icelandic state for centuries. The ship was a conduit not for goods, but for jurisprudence. It ensured that Iceland, despite its isolation, remained part of the wider Scandinavian legal and cultural world. It also highlights the nature of the Knarr's role. It wasn't just for bulk cargo, it was the primary means of long-distance passenger travel. Important people, bishops, chieftains, poets, and lawyers traveled on these ships. They were not luxury liners. The passengers would have had little shelter, sleeping among the cargo, but they were reliable and they were safe for the most part. They were the bridge that carried not just the body of a man like Skapti, but the very ideas of law and governance that held a society together. Number 7. The Black Blood of the Viking Age. The Viking ship, whether a longship or a Knarr, had a secret ingredient that made it work. It was not the quality of the oak or the skill of the shipwright. It was a sticky, black, foul-smelling substance, pine tar. A wooden ship is in a constant battle with the sea. The water wants to get in and rot the wood. Tar was the primary weapon in this battle. It was used to seal the gaps between the clinker-built planks. It was used to waterproof the woolen sail. It was used to preserve the ropes. Without a constant supply of tar, the Viking Age would have ground to a halt. But high-quality pine tar cannot be made just anywhere. It requires a specific process and a specific resource, old-growth pine forests. The best tar came from the resin-rich wood of pine tree roots. The process involved slowly burning the wood in a low-oxygen environment, a carefully constructed kiln or pit, which would cause the tar to sweat out and collect. This was a specialized industry, and the main centers of production were in the vast pine forests of Scandinavia, particularly in Norway and Sweden. For the Viking communities that had settled in lands without pine forests like Iceland, Greenland, Orkney, or Dublin, tar was a critical import. It was a strategic resource, as vital as iron for weapons or grain for food. A chieftain in Iceland might have a ship, but he could not maintain it without tar. He was completely dependent on the trade with Norway. That this trade was carried out by the Knarr. A merchant in Bergen would buy barrels of tar from the producers in the forest districts. These barrels would be loaded deep into the hold of a Knarr. It was a heavy, messy cargo. A leaking barrel could ruin other goods. But it was immensely profitable. The merchant was selling not just a commodity, but the very means of survival for the overseas settlements. This monopoly on tar gave the King of Norway enormous power. He could control the flow of this essential material. By the 13th century, the Norwegian crown had established a formal monopoly on the trade with its North Atlantic colonies. All trade had to go through the port of Bergen. This allowed the king to tax the trade and to use the supply of goods like tar as a political lever. If the Icelanders were defiant, the king could threaten to cut off the supply of tar, effectively grounding their fleet. The Knarr was the instrument of this monopoly. The ship sailed in a controlled system, sanctioned by the crown. The cargo manifest of a Knarr sailing for Iceland would have read like a list of the colony's dependencies: iron, grain, timber, and always barrels of black tar. It was the lifeblood of their maritime world. Every time an Icelander caulked the seams of his fishing boat or treated his roof timbers, he was using a product that had made a long journey in the belly of a Knarr, a sticky reminder of his connection to and dependence on the old country. Number 6. A floating ark. In the year 890, a farmer named Ketil sold his land in the Sogn district of western Norway. He had decided to leave. The taxes of King Harald Fairhair were too high, the land was crowded. He had heard tales of Iceland, a new land where a man could be his own master. He used the silver from the sale of his farm to buy passage for his family and his most valuable possessions on a Knarr. His most valuable possessions were not silver or fine clothes. They were his animals: a milk cow, a few sheep, a pig, and a horse. These animals were the difference between starting a new life and starving. But getting them across 800 miles of open ocean was a monumental challenge. The Knarr was not designed for livestock. It was a wide open boat. Kettle and the ship's crew would have had to build temporary pens in the hold to keep the animals from shifting in rough seas and capsizing the vessel. There was no shelter from the elements. The animals were exposed to the wind, the rain, and the constant sea spray. The journey was an ordeal. The animals would have been terrified and seasick. The cow, crucial for providing milk for the children on the voyage, would have been difficult to manage. Fodder and fresh water had to be carried, taking up precious space and adding to the weight. These supplies were strictly rationed. If the journey was delayed by storms or bad winds, they could run out. The smell in the hold would have been overwhelming. The sounds of frightened, sick animals would have been constant. This was the reality of the settlement of Iceland. It was not a heroic voyage of warriors. It was a messy, smelly, and dangerous journey by farmers crammed into a small boat with their entire livelihood. Ketil's Knarr was a floating ark. It carried the genetic stock that would populate a new country. The Icelandic horse, sheep, and cow are all direct descendants of the animals that made this journey. They are unique breeds, isolated for over 1,000 years. They are living artifacts of the settlement, and the Knarr was the vessel that carried them. Many animals and people did not survive the journey. A single bad storm could finish a ship, but enough of them made it. For about 60 years, a steady stream of these floating farms crossed the North Atlantic. They carried a few dozen people and a handful of animals at a time. Slowly, painstakingly, they transported an entire agricultural ecosystem from Norway to Iceland. The Knarr's design was what made this possible. Its stability and its large capacity were essential. A longship could never have made this journey. It was too narrow, too unstable, and had no room for cargo or livestock. The settlement of Iceland was a logistical operation, and the Knarr was the key piece of equipment. It was a slow, ugly, but profoundly effective tool for moving not just people, but the entire biological foundation of a new society. Number 5, the shipwright's formula. In a small bay near Roskilde in Denmark around the year 1025, a master shipwright named Finn laid the keel for a new ship. This was not going to be a warship. A local merchant had commissioned a Knarr, a ship to haul goods to England or across the Baltic. Finn was a master of his craft, a tradition passed down through generations. He did not work from written plans or blueprints. The design was in his head, in his hands, and in his eyes. The secret to the Knarr and to all Viking ships was the clinker-built method. Finn started with the keel, a solid piece of oak that formed the backbone of the ship. Then he and his team began to attach the strakes, the long planks that formed the hull. Each plank overlapped the one below it, like shingles on a roof. They were fastened together with iron rivets. This created a hull that was both strong and remarkably flexible. It could twist and bend with the waves, absorbing their energy rather than fighting it. But the real genius was in how they sourced their wood. Finn would not just cut planks from a log. He would search the forest for trees that had the right shape naturally. For the curved ribs that formed the skeleton of the ship, he would look for trees with branches that grew at the right angle. He would split the log radially, following the grain of the wood. This made the planks incredibly strong and resistant to splitting. It was a wasteful process in terms of wood, but it produced a superior ship. The Knarr's design was a specific formula. Unlike the longship, which was long and narrow for speed, the Knarr was wide and deep. It had a beam-to-length ratio of about 1:4, whereas a longship was closer to 1:7. This made it slower but much more stable and able to carry a heavy load. It also had fewer oars. It was primarily a sailing vessel with a single large square sail made of wool. This meant it needed a smaller crew, usually only a handful of men, which made it more economical to operate. Finn's Knarr also had distinct fore and aft decks called castles, which provided some shelter for the crew and a place to handle the sail. The main part of the ship was an open hold, a vast space for cargo. This was its purpose. The ship was a simple, elegant solution to a specific problem: how to move a lot of stuff across the sea safely and cheaply. The knowledge to build a ship like this was one of the most valuable technologies of the Viking Age. As the Vikings traveled, they took this knowledge with them. Shipyards were established in places like Dublin and the Isle of Man. The design was adapted to local conditions and local timber, but the basic formula, the clinker-built hull and the deep, wide profile of the cargo ship, remained the same. This technology was a catalyst for economic growth. It was an innovation that allowed for the reliable, long-distance transport of bulk goods for the first time in Northern Europe. Finn, the shipwright, was not just building a boat, he was building an engine of commerce. His knowledge, shared and refined over centuries, created the vessel that built the Viking economic world. Number 4, the real estate developer of Greenland. And Eric the Red was a killer. He was exiled from Norway for manslaughter. He settled in Iceland, but his temper got him in trouble again. After killing 2 more men, he was outlawed from Iceland for 3 years by the Althing around 982. He needed a place to go. He had heard stories of a large land to the west, discovered by a man named Gunnbjorn Ulfsson when he was blown off course. Eric decided to go and find it. He spent his 3 years of exile exploring the coast of this new land. He found a system of deep fjords on the southwestern coast. The inner reaches of these fjords were surprisingly green, with good pasture for livestock. He saw the potential. This could be a new Iceland, a new home for Norse farmers, but he knew he couldn't settle it alone. He needed people. When his exile was over, he returned to Iceland, and he began a marketing campaign. He called the new land Greenland. He said the name would entice people to go there. He was a promoter, a real estate developer, selling a dream. He told stories of the rich pastures, the abundant seals and caribou. He downplayed the glaciers and the brutal winters. His sales pitch worked. The saga of the Greenlanders says that in the summer of 985, a great expedition set out from Iceland to colonize Greenland. 25 ships departed. They were all Knarrs. This was a mass migration organized and led by one man. Each ship was loaded with a family, their followers, their thralls, and their livestock. The ships were floating homesteads carrying everything needed to start a new life on the edge of the world. The journey was a disaster. The fleet was hit by a terrible storm. Some ships were forced to turn back to Iceland. Others were lost at sea. Only 14 of the original 25 ships made it to Greenland, but that was enough. Several hundred people landed and established 2 settlements, the eastern and western settlements. Eric the Red's great gamble was entirely dependent on the Knarr. No other ship could have even attempted such a migration. The longship was a warship, not a colonizer. The Knarr was the only vessel that could carry the people, the animals, and the supplies needed. The ship's capacity and stability were the enabling technology for Eric's vision. He had chosen the site for his own farm, Bertalid, at the head of a fjord. It was the best farmland in the new colony. So he became the paramount chieftain of Greenland, a wealthy and powerful man. His success was built on his salesmanship, his leadership, and his brutality. Sure, but it was also built on the simple, functional design of the cargo ship. Without the Knarr, his ambition would have been just a story. The ship was the tool that turned his marketing plan into a new nation. Number 3, the first oil shock. For over 300 years, the Norse colony in Greenland had a profitable, if precarious, existence. Their economy was built on a single high-value export, walrus ivory. It was the white gold of the North, and for a long time, the Greenlanders had a virtual monopoly on the European market. The tusks, transported to Bergen on the annual Knarr voyage, were Greenland's currency. They were what the Greenlanders used to buy the grain, iron, and timber they could not produce themselves. Then, in the 13th and 14th centuries, things began to change. The world was getting bigger. The Crusades had opened up new trade routes to the east. And, more importantly for Greenland, Portuguese sailors were pushing south along the coast of Africa. They were looking for a sea route to India, but they found something else along the way, a new source of ivory. The elephant ivory. Elephant tusks were larger than walrus tusks. The ivory was of a higher quality, less prone to yellowing. And as the Portuguese established trading posts in West Africa, it began to flow into Europe in large quantities. Suddenly, the Greenlanders had competition. For a craftsman in Paris or a merchant in London, the choice was simple. The new African ivory was better and increasingly cheaper. The market for walrus ivory began to collapse. This was a catastrophic economic shock for the Greenland colony. It was like an oil-rich nation suddenly discovering that the world no longer needs oil. The single commodity that propped up their entire society was becoming worthless. The effect on the Knarr trade was direct and devastating. The voyage to Greenland was long, dangerous, and expensive. It was only profitable as long as the cargo the ship brought back was of extremely high value. As the price of walrus ivory fell, the profit margin for the merchants in Bergen shrank. Soon, it disappeared altogether. The voyage was no longer worth the risk. The Knarrs stopped coming. The lifeline was cut, not by a storm or by ice, but by a simple change in global market economics. The Greenlanders were left stranded. They could no longer trade for the goods they needed to survive. Their iron tools wore out and could not be replaced. Their supply of grain and timber ended. Archaeological evidence from the final years of the Norse settlement shows a community in steep decline. They resorted to making tools from bone and stone. Their diet became almost exclusively seal. They were a European society slowly losing its European technology and culture, all because a ship, the Knarr, could no longer make a profit sailing to their shores. The collapse of the Greenland colony is a complex story involving climate change and other factors. But at its heart, it is also the story of the first global commodity crash, a financial crisis that doomed a nation because its only export had been made obsolete by a competitor from the other side of the world. Number 2, the river that led to the Silk Road. In the 9th century, a group of Norsemen, known as the Rus, pushed east. They were not crossing the open ocean, but navigating the great river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine. They were traders and mercenaries, and their goal was to reach the two great superpowers of the age, the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople and the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. The ships they used for this journey were not identical to the ocean-going Knarr, but they were built on the same principles. They were clinker-built, with a shallow draft and a wide beam for carrying cargo. They were adaptable. They could be sailed on the open waters of the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, but they could also be rowed upright. And crucially, they could be dragged overland. A Norse trader named Rurik might have made this journey. He would start in Sweden, sailing his river Knarr across the Baltic and into the Gulf of Finland. He would then enter the Neva River and sail into Lake Ladoga. From there, he began the hard part. He would follow a network of rivers like the Volkhov and the Lovat. But these rivers were not fully connected. There were sections of land known as portages that he had to cross. Here, the ship's design was critical. The crew would unload the cargo, then using rollers made from logs, they would physically haul the ship weighing several tons out of the water and drag it through the forest for miles until they reached the next navigable river. This was back-breaking work, but it allowed them to cross the great European watershed. They would eventually reach the Dnieper River, which flowed south. Down the Dnieper, they would sail past the rapids, which were another dangerous obstacle. Finally, they would reach the Black Sea. From there, it was a relatively easy sail to the magnificent city of Constantinople, which they called Miklagard, the Great City. Here, they traded their northern goods furs, amber, honey, and slaves for silk, silver, spices, and wine. Another route went down the Volga River through the lands of the Khazars to the Caspian Sea. From there, they could trade with the Arab world. Archaeologists have found thousands of silver dirhams from the Caliphate in Viking hordes in Scandinavia. This was the profit from that trade. This river road from the Baltic to the Black Sea was one of the great trade arteries of the early Middle Ages. It connected northern Europe to the riches of the East. It was the Viking Silk Road, and the ship that made it possible was a cousin of the Knarr. It was a cargo ship adapted for a riverine environment. Its simple, robust, and portable design allowed these traders to cross a continent. It was this ship and the wealth it generated that led to the foundation of the first Russian state, the Kievan Rus, by these same Norse traders. The impact of this eastern connection was immense, and it all started with a boat built to carry things. Number 1, a trader reports to a king. Sometime around the year 890, a man named Ottar came to the court of Alfred the Great, the King of Wessex in England. Alfred was a scholar as well as a king. He was interested in geography in the world beyond his own borders. He and his court scholars interviewed this visitor from the north. The account of this interview was written down and included in an Old English translation of a history of the world. It is one of the most remarkable documents of the Viking Age. It is a first-hand account of the life of a Norse trader. Ottar was not a raider. He was a wealthy farmer and merchant. He told King Alfred that he lived northernmost of all the Northmen. He was from Hålogaland in the far north of Norway, deep inside the Arctic Circle. He described his farm with its herds of reindeer and his main business, which was trading with the Sami people. He traded for furs, for walrus ivory, and for the incredibly strong ropes made of walrus or seal hide. He then described his trade voyages. He told Alfred about a journey he made, sailing north and then east, around the northern cape of Scandinavia and into the White Sea. He was exploring, trying to see how far the land extended. He was the first person we know of to have made this journey. He was a merchant and an explorer, driven by curiosity and the search for new markets. But his main trade route was south. He described loading his ship with the products of the north and sailing down the long coast of Norway. His ship was a Knarr, though he did not use that specific word. He called it an ask, but his description of its function makes it clear it was a cargo vessel. He told Alfred about the main trading ports along the way, Sirenjashiel in southern Norway and Hedeby in Denmark. From there, the goods would be traded on into the rest of Europe. Ottar's account is sober and practical. He is not boasting of battles or heroic deeds. He is talking about business. He tells Alfred about the taxes he pays to his king in the form of furs. He talks about distances in terms of how many days' sail it is from one point to another. He gives a precise, detailed picture of the economic geography of the North. This is the hidden world of the Viking Age. It is not the world of the sagas, full of feuds and glory. It is the world of a man like Ottar, a practical man of business whose life revolved around the seasonal rhythms of farming, trading, and sailing. His tool was his ship, a vessel designed not for fighting, but for carrying the valuable, bulky commodities of the north to the markets of the south. The Knarr was the ship of Ottar. It was the ship that moved the furs, the ivory, and the hides that were the foundation of the Scandinavian economy. It was the ship that connected the remote Arctic communities with the great trading hubs of Europe. Ottar's calm, factual report to a foreign king gives us a rare glimpse into this world. It shows us that behind the stereotype of the Viking warrior, there was the reality of the Viking merchant. And the most important tool he had, the one that made his entire world possible, was his slow, reliable, and world-changing cargo ship.